Good morning. I want to welcome everybody officially to this morning's webinar in the Changing Church series that's sponsored by a whole bunch of wonderful folks, the list of which I will go down in a minute. Last week, we started a really interesting conversation about lessons we could learn today from past experiences of the church of going through times of dramatic change and sort of, what can we learn from that? How is our situation like theirs? How is it different? And it was such a rich conversation that we decided to ask Matt to continue it today. Matt led last week's webinar and is doing it again today. And his PhD in history, church history, and his love of church history makes it an interesting conversation when he's leading it. So, Matt, we really appreciate your doing this for us again today. Let me tell you who the sponsors for this webinar series are. The Center for Healthy Churches, with Matt as its assistant director, is one of those. New Matrix, which I lead with my colleague, Deborah Wright. The Church Network, Phil Martin is the person, and they're the folks who, along with CHC itself, host all the recordings of our webinars. If you want to go back and look at last week's scintillating conversation. The Presbyterian Foundation, I believe Paul Greer, I saw Paul Greer's picture on here somewhere earlier. The Charlie Kirb Center at Belmont University, the Gardner Webb University Divinity School, Baptist News Global, Truett Seminary at Baylor, and the Truett Network, and the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving. With that, and sort of already having thanked Matt for coming back again, Matt, I'm going to let you begin. I'm going to ask people, because last week some of the most interesting conversation happened in the chat. So as you're listening to Matt, if either questions come up or insights that you want to share, patterns that you see, commonalities, differences, put those all in the chat and we'll capture all that. And I hope that we'll have some opportunity that before we're done today to get to some of the questions that you want to pose back to Matt based on his presentation. So given that ask, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you pick it up kind of where you left us last week.
Very good. So a couple things. First, Jeannie Troutman, I've made you a co-host as well. So you've got the ability to admit additional people as they come in. And thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. I am going to leave a little more time for questions and even maybe some dialogue. We don't always do dialogue's a little challenging, and maybe we'll just use the chat feature to get there in some ways, but don't be surprised if Jim or I maybe even engage some of your questions and even turn them back on you a little bit. I actually have left part of my presentation for maybe all of us to name some things that we see. So last week, what I did was I talked about some general things that have taken place in church history, some trends in which when the church finds itself in the midst of challenging circumstances and has to adapt, and some things that tend to be true when the church has actually managed to adapt. Talked about really even beyond the church, taking it all the way back into the Hebrew Bible as well. Today, I'm going to kind of narrow down in my own kind of specialty of historical research in some ways. So I want to share my screen with you. Hold on one second. So, and talk about one particular moment in which that's been true for in American Christianity. So let me start my slideshow here. All right. So what we're talking about is we're talking about the adaptive character of American religion. So one of the things that's good about American religion, it's also one of the things, there's also a shadow side, there is for human beings. Usually what our strengths are also have corresponding shadow sides. And one of the best things about the character of American religion has been religious liberty, religious freedom. A non-established church and even denominationalism, even competition has created a kind of a sense of dynamism in the American church. Sometimes that borders over into consumer Christianity and how market forces oftentimes kind of co-opt the church. So it does have a shadow side to it. But one of the upsides to it is the American church, unlike some other times in history, the American church has proven itself fairly adaptable in its history. And there's a variety of reasons why that's true. Part of what I'm going to talk about today is kind of what I think laid the foundation for that, and then use some examples that emerged from that. So, but before I get there, what I want to do is I want to invite you, if I asked you, what do you remember about the religious life of America in the 90s? I don't want you to answer out loud, but if I said, what do you think of when you think of religion, pardon me, in the 90s, what do you think of? I'm going to let you roll that over for a second. Now, I'm going to answer the question from my own perspective. The 90s were a depressing decade for Christianity in America. If you go back and you read the records, church attendance declined throughout the nation. The number of new people connecting to the church plummeted. Leading intellectuals in the nation were questioning many of Christianity's most cherished doctrines. A lot of ministers, if you go back and read the record, complained that the only thing that young Americans thought about was sex. The only thing that married Americans thought about was making money. Furthermore, ministers complained that even those who were coming to church regularly seemed somewhat apathetic. And to top it all off, I don't know if you remember this, but the United States Congress passed a law that some Christians saw as threatening the very existence of the church in America. If you put all that together, it sounds pretty depressing, doesn't it? But not particularly surprising, I'll bet. Many of you watched. I watched as the folks that were kind of coming in today. We probably, the average age of the people on the webinar today is probably in the 60s, I'm guessing. So we've been around long enough to watch as religion has seemed to decline in our nation over the past few years. Do those complaints sound familiar? Why aren't more young people in church? Why don't people keep the Sabbath anymore? Why is Christian morality so threatened in America? You're probably not surprised at all to hear that the 90s were a depressing decade in the life of the church. There's only one problem with that statement, because I'm not talking about the 1990s. I'm talking about the 1790s. Imagine, if you will, the years following the American Revolution. A loosely organized group of colonial militia has taken on the most powerful military force in the world, and they win, shocks the whole world. In the aftermath, it was almost as if the new Americans had no idea what to do with their newfound sense of freedom, like the dog that kind of caught the car, except in this case, the car felt like a big giant steak. So great ideals, which had kind of stirred the new nation into being, and in the 90s, in the 1790s, gave way to what historians read back into the critiques of the day as a very materialistic spirit. Those were the words of many pastors in the 1790s. In town after town along the eastern seaboard, nearly half the population in the 1790s simply packed up and moved west for the twin promises of free land and a better life. And then you go back to the Capitol, a conversation was taking place about religion in the new nation, and influenced by the Enlightenment, a large number of influential politicians, Thomas Jefferson, the most prominent among them, were calling for an end to any state support of religion. Our third president believed that every individual should be free to practice any religion or none. A man's religion, quote, neither breaks my legs nor picks my pocket, said Jefferson. So the government should allow individuals to believe as they see fit. And for us, you know, in the 21st century, as Americans, I was trying to see if we had any non-Americans on. We have a couple of Canadian friends that jump on our webinar from time to time, and I didn't see them. But for us as Americans, those ideas sound normal to us. They fit like an old pair of shoes, right? They're not strange to us. But in Jefferson's day, they were incredibly weird and threatening to a lot of people. Very few people outside of America believed that society could function and flourish without a union of church and state. And then if you put yourself in the shoes of those supported ministers, many people believed that God had given America this special destiny. It was going to be a city set on a hill. And so to disconnect the church from the state seemed like the worst kind of heresy in some ways. But the interesting thing is what happened in the 1790s was all of this bad news for religion in the eyes of so many people. But what we know is what happened in that moment. The 1790s marked a significant decline for the institution of American religion, but they happened in the immediate context of what happened immediately afterwards was the unleashing of a particularly American approach to religion that led to tremendous growth of the church. And adaptation was at the middle of that. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about, if you want to go back and read a really good book, and I talked about this last week, a lot of what I'm talking about today draws on the work of one of the best scholars of American religion in the 20th and early 21st centuries, a guy by the name of Nathan Hatch, who until recently was president of Wake Forest University. If memory serves, he retired about a year ago. Prior to that, he was dean and provost at Notre Dame, and he wrote this book, which at the time was considered by a lot of historians, a lot of reviewers of American religious history, the most important work on religion in the early republic ever written. And what Hatch did was basically he took the growth of American Christianity and he connected it to some things that were unique at the time. They're not unique anymore, but were unique in the world, or at least in the Western world. He took kind of the democratic impulse that unleashed the American Revolution, and he followed that through the early history of American religion. And he drew out a lot of things out of his study that continue to shape the way, the form and character of American religion to this day. And I want to point out a few examples that kind of emerged out of that period. His underlying thesis basically is this: American religion succeeds, it grows because of its democratic impulses. American religion, another thing he does is he compares and he contrasts American religion with European religion. And what Hatch says is that the reason wí American religion has so much energy, is so dynamic in the 19th and the early to mid portions of the 20th century is because American religion, as opposed to European religion, is highly egalitarian, it is highly accessible, and it is highly experiential. He does that by tracing 5 different groups, and I'm probably not going to get all 5 groups, but he follows the Baptists, he follows the Methodists, he follows the Christian movement, he follows, actually I am going to get all 5, the birth of the Black church and the birth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he looks at all 5 of those movements and he talks about what's happening in them that is indicative of these impulses. And then he draws out some conclusions for his readers about what that means for American religion. And I would say is still very, very true of American religion in a lot of ways. Now, I'm not going to go deep into all 5 of those groups. I'm not going to talk about a lot of Baptist history or Methodist history or Mormon history, things like that. I'm going to actually get down to the ground level and talk about some of the very practical adaptations that emerged in that period. And then I'm going to kind of talk about what they represent in some ways. So what you're looking at is a picture of a camp meeting. Now, camp meetings, we don't do meetings like this very much anymore. I'd ask for a show of hands if I could see everybody. It'd be interesting to see how many hands went up of people that have attended a 2-week revival at some point in their lifetime. I never have. I'm 51 years old. We didn't have 2-week revivals back in the day. Revivals, by the time I came along, were church revivals, not camp meetings. But in the early history of the American Republic, one of the most interesting things that burst into being were these large-scale meetings of people for the purpose of religious gatherings. They didn't call them revivals when they first started off, because to say something was a revival would have been, at that point, American religion was still largely shaped by Puritanism, and there was a rejection of human instrumentality. And so to call something revival means you've walked far enough away from Calvinism. If you can plan a revival, then you're not a thoroughgoing Calvinist, because that means human instrumentality is involved in that in some way. So they just called them gatherings. Probably a lot of people in this room are old enough to remember and have participated in large-scale religious gatherings. In Baptist circles, we called them association meetings, which when I was a young pastor, you could not pay me enough money for me to want to go to association meetings. Sometimes I had to go because I was the pastor. I didn't anymore want to go to those meetings, the man in the moon. They were boring. They took my time. And yet at the beginning of the 19th century, sometimes these gatherings, often at association meetings, were so large that literally people would come and they would camp for days at a time. There was a meeting in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, that a lot of people trace to the beginning of the Second Great Awakening in 1802, if memory serves, where a third of the population of the state of Kentucky was present. Now, wrap your brain around that for a moment. Billy Graham crusades in their largest iteration didn't come close to what some of these meetings approximated. Part of what happened and part of what made these so unusual was European religion in a lot of ways was very, very focused on the church, and was very much a command and control structure. It was about order. It was about stability. By the time the 19th century rolls along, religion is a very conservative force in Europe. But in America, while there were some conservative impulses in terms of kind of, the way it shaped people's moral and character and things like that, religion was incredibly unpredictable and creative. And the camp meeting, we look back on it in history and it may seem strange to us, but for them, it was new and it was exotic. People wanted to be together. And the idea that preaching was going to take place outdoors, and that oftentimes what you began to have happen was people of different denominational settings would come and they would take turns preaching, which in and of itself was a little bit threatening to certain leaders. And so what you had happening in these meetings was a tremendous amount of energy. Now, more went into camp meetings than simply religion. One of the jokes of the day was there was as many marriages that came out of camp meetings as there were conversions, because they were also social gatherings. Imagine if you've moved out onto the frontier and you live at a distance from people and you're hungry for companionship, and the only people that you've seen for days at a time are your family, and under the cover of there's going to be preaching and singing, down at the right next to the Baptist church or the Presbyterian church or the Methodist church for a few days, that provided cover for large social gatherings to take place. But because they were happening in such a way that that what made the camp meetings successful in a lot of ways was the intensity of them, the immediacy of them. That's also not a way that religion had functioned in its European forms, and not even in its early Puritan forms in America. So there was an intensity to these gatherings, both on the social side and on the religious side, that created that unleashed a lot of impulses in American religion that we still live with to this day. You can trace the mega church as an institution to the camp meeting. Without camp meetings, we don't have megachurches. And the same things that make megachurches successful in this day and time, in a lot of ways, they share the exact same impulses that made camp meetings such a dynamic instrument of religious growth in the early republic in America. All right, let me keep going. All right, hymn books and revival songs. Now, you can, if you want to, you can trace the theological course of American Christianity, and not just American Christianity, of all of Christianity, through the songs that we sing, and whether or not people are actually singing songs. We take that for granted in the 21st century, but there was actually a time in American Christianity prior to the American Revolution where congregational singing was considered somewhat suspect. It was either suspect because it would excite the passions, which Puritans often were trying to avoid, or because it was overly structured. The people who had the primitivist impulse were saying there are no tunes to songs in the Bible. So how do we know which tune to pick? And so what sometimes would happen is there would be a psalm that a church would try to recite and even try to give music to. But what would happen is you'd have different people in the same congregation using different tunes, and it was sheer and utter chaos. That makes no sense to us in the 21st century, but it was something that 18th century Christians argued about a lot. But in the latter portions of the 18th century and into the 19th century, what started to happen was that the impulse for religious music was so strong, it started in the home. People started singing these spiritual songs at homes. They didn't call them hymns yet. Spiritual songs existed before hymns did. And pastors began to recognize that what was happening in people's homes was so powerful that it was having a huge positive impact on their spiritual growth, that pastors recognized they had to figure out a way to bring it into the church. And so little by little, it started off with established Christianity in England, Isaac Watts. It started among the respectable churches in England, but the more revivalistic churches in America held it at a distance until the early portions of the 19th century. And then what you had happen, in really just the span of one generation, we went from skepticism all the way over to a full embrace upon the part of American Christianity. If you look back in the early portions of the 19th century, one of the most lucrative fields in publishing was producing new hymn books. Again, that sounds strange to our ears in the 21st century because American religion doesn't have that kind of handle on culture in the way that it did in the early portion of the 19th century. But think about that. One of the most lucrative aspects of publishing in the early 19th century was creating new books that people were hungry for, to learn new songs and to be able to sing new songs in church. Another thing that emerged that was different from European religion and American religion were the practice of itinerant preaching and circuit riding. Now, in the 18th century, itinerant preaching largely emerged as a result of the fact that there were more people hungry for the practice of religion than there were preachers to fill it. At the founding of the Republic in 1776, and I'm going to share these numbers in a little bit, so I'm doing it from memory here. From memory, there were about 2,000. It was either 1,500 or 2,500 pastors in the United States at the founding of the Republic. So there was a fairly significant population, about 2.5 million people, not nearly enough pastors to be able to provide what the people were hungry for. And so itinerant preaching was more about going from place to place and preaching to isolated outposts of people that were members of a church but lived at a distance from that congregation. But in the 19th century, what started to happen was you went from just people going to church outposts to people who would literally go out and preach out in the fields and preach out in the countryside, and anywhere they could get up a crowd, they were willing to preach. And then that got formalized over time. You're looking at a picture of Francis Asbury, the the Methodist bishop and circuit rider, the one who originated circuit riding and then formalized circuit riding. And then in Baptist churches, what often happened is you had churches that would meet one time a month, and then you'd have a different pastor who would actually pastor 4 different congregations and then ride on horseback on Saturday evening to the church that he was going to preach at on Sunday. And so what you had happen was ways to try to distribute religion to where the people were in whatever form, wherever place that they lived. Another big thing that took place in the early portions of the 19th century was the birth of the Black church movement. I wish I had a lot of time to kind of dig into this. In the 18th century, the early portions of the 18th century, most slaves were not Christians. But in the latter portions of the 18th century in the North, there was a movement that slowly grew to evangelize the Black population, the free Black population, and even the slave population. It was resisted by Southern ministers because there was the fear that if you Christianize someone, what is the implication for what that means in terms of reducing the distance in the social order? If we're brothers and sisters in Christ, can we still own slaves? That was a real question that got asked. In the South, what happened in the beginning of the 19th century was they also realized, though, that it was a way to kind of create kind of a conservative hierarchy in some ways, and that hierarchy got reinforced. But the unintended consequence of the birth of the Black church movement in America was that once they handed over the gospel, once they started to get out of the way, that a unique form of American Christianity began to grow. So our Negro spirituals, what are called Negro spirituals, are one example of that. But there's all kinds of interesting things that begin to percolate from the bottom up within the Black church that still are powerfully shaping American religion to this day. Richard Allen is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's the picture that you're looking at. And if you really, really want to get into kind of down deep into 19th century American history, there's a really wonderful book called Traveling, that's with a B, Traveling On, by a man named Mikhail Sobel, who talks all about the growth of indigenous American Black Christianity and how it continues to shape not only the Black church, but the American church. Part of what that grew out of was this shift from the Calvinism or the strong Reformation ideals of Luther and Calvin that had kind of dominated Protestant theology since the Protestant Reformation and carried on in a different way through Puritanism. What America began to do is they began to modulate Protestantism in a lot of ways. If you know much about the history of the missions movement, there was no missions movement prior to the last few years of the 18th century. There was no worldwide impulse in Protestantism to share the gospel with the whole world. And yet the idea had begun to shift that, and technology made it possible to share the gospel more broadly. And in doing that, that's one of the things that was kind of riding along with this democratic impulse, this egalitarian impulse in some ways. That if you're going to evangelize the whole world, then the whole world had to be capable of receiving it. But once you begin to preach and once you begin to back off and you let indigenous Christianity begin to emerge wherever it begins to emerge, that keeps the flywheel moving even more, which creates an even greater sense of egalitarianism, an even greater sense of inclusion. That the forms of Christianity that emerged out of the Black church were particular to the Black church and actually ended up empowering the Black church. One of the reasons why to this day the Black church is still at the center of the African American community is it's one of the places in culture in which African Americans were fully or almost fully, they weren't in the early portions of the 19th century, were fully empowered. And so the Black church continues to be a pillar of culture in a lot of ways, and it continues to have a lot of energy as a result of that. So that's something that we have to pay attention to, and it's one of the things that emerged out of that shift that began to take place in the early portions of the 19th century in the United States. And here's the result of that. We talked about the growth of the ministerial population in, looks like it's 1,500. In 1776, there were 1,500 ministers in the American Republic. In 1840, only 64 years later, there were 40,000 ministers. That's explosive growth. And that wasn't just among the ministerial population. In 1776, and this is the fiction that we tend to live with, this has become part of the American myth. We have this myth in American culture that at the founding of the Republic, we were a highly religious place. Part of that comes from that city on a hill idea that came into the colonies with the Puritans. But the truth is, at the founding of the Republic, America was not a religious place, not in terms of adherence. Only 17% of the American population, 17% of 2.5 million people, were connected to some congregation or form of religion in the United States. 180 years later, 1956, 79% of 164 million people were connected to a church. It's one of the great success stories in the history of all of Christianity. And according to Hatch, and according to Matt Cook, for what it's worth, if we're going to understand what that looks like, what that basically means is, in American forms, what it looks like is religion that is experiential, religion that is egalitarian, and religion that is accessible. Now, what does that have to do with this moment, 21st century Christianity? Well, I want to actually pose it as some questions in some ways. So if I asked you, what does the experiential impulse look like in the church in America today? And what does it look like in your congregational setting? What would I don't want you to answer out loud yet, although we're going to get to it in just a moment. What would your answer to that question be? And the question I would ask for you is it something that you as a minister fear, or is it something that you embrace, or some of both? What does the egalitarian impulse look like? And where does that egalitarian impulse need to be unleashed in the church and in your congregation? And then on the experiential side, how can we or you make the experience of faith more accessible in the church and in your congregation? I think there's a lot of things taking place in 21st century Christianity that are experiential and that are egalitarian and are about accessibility. Some of those things are things that have a shadow side to them. Some of those things that I think are things to be celebrated. I think those things on their own, just like the democratic impulse, these impulses in American Christianity are a strength of American Christianity with the shadow side. I think that these impulses actually tend to create a lot of energy in American Christianity. So I tend to be positive around these three impulses, even as I recognize some ways in which they create weaknesses that go along with them. We have been living for the last 40 years or so in a new shift of worship, about the forms that worship takes in some ways. And making worship accessible to people, I think, is something to be celebrated. It has a downside to it, maybe in some ways, but I'm positive on that. The egalitarian impulse, a lot of what we're dealing with in the Me Too movement in church is an outflow of the egalitarian impulse in the church. The question that churches are going to have to ask and answer is, are we really making it possible for everybody to be at the table in terms of how we decide who we are and what we do? Or do only certain people get to be involved in that? The experience of faith, that's a broader category in some ways. The question that I want to pose a little bit, and I want to talk about here in just a moment, is when we talk about the experience of faith, is how much does people's religious lives intersect the rest of their lives? How much does their interaction with God and their faith in God shape the ongoing lived experience? In the early portions of the 19th century, the answer to that question was especially by the middle of the 19th century, it was a huge part of their lives. That's less true now. part of that's because religion is one force among a bunch of different forces, and that's different. But on the other hand, if we grant that that must be true, that religion is just one small part of people's lives rather than touching a lot of different parts of people's lives and the way that they experience their lives, then it may be that we've given up too much in some way. So I've dangled some stuff in the water that I want to circle back and talk to in a little bit. I want to turn it over to Jim, who's going to kind of moderate, maybe ask a few questions of his own. So I'm going to leave the questions up, though, for us to be thinking about. So, Jim, let me turn it back over to you. And Jim, you're muted.
I forgot that Jeannie reached in there and helpfully muted me a little bit ago. So you're talking about these three pieces, that kind of three movement aspects: egalitarianism, accessibility, and experiential religion. And so a question for me is, what do you think what are the headwinds? What are the anti all those things that we have to deal with in the church in America today? Where does the church, as you see it broadly, where and how and why do we resist those impulses?
Well, so on the experiential side of things, probably non-experiential probably looks more like ritualistic. It tends to be, although ritual can be a form of experience, it is the experiential impulse in the 19th century church was, instead of just showing up and listening to your pastor talk at length about, just explain the Bible to you or talk about theology to you, it made your participation in the process something that was instrumental to your experience of faith. Singing was a classic example of that. Being able to respond in the moment was a classic example of that. The ability over time, Sunday school, what Sunday school did was put the Bible in people's hands and put them in conversation around that in some ways. So it broadened the number of ways that people could participate in the process in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So I think for us today, the opposite of that is when we have very specific ideas about the way that we think it must always, what it must sound like and the forms that it must take. And we insist that people participate only in those forms and in those ways of doing things, rather than freeing people up to experience it in the way that is particular to their individuality and their giftedness and their personal experience. On the egalitarian side, that one's a little bit easier. The question at that point is, in some ways, it's a different version of what I just said, in that it is to say that church, faith, that much of what we live and experience in the world is something to be resisted, and that what church does, what faith does, is it's a form of ordering the world. Now, I believe that faith is a form of ordering the world. But in a lot of ways, when the most important impulse is to kind of say from above, this is what life must look like, and that I'm the person that can tell you what that is, that the shadow side of that is very much a command and control structure. And I'm letting my own theology kind of get in the way in some ways, but if you want to pick a fight with the Theo bro, that's really what I'm talking about in a lot of ways. That is anti-egalitarian at its very best. It's also tends to be sexist in a lot of ways. So one of the interesting things that's kind of taken place, like right now in the life of the American church, is look how many powerful female voices in their own subsets of American Christianity are the voices that are being attacked in a lot of ways. So Rachel Held Evans was that person in a lot of ways. Beth Moore on the evangelical side is that person in a lot of ways. And when they get out of line, there are people that want to put them back in line in a lot of ways. So that's part of what I'm talking about. As far as accessibility goes, I mean, the most recent example we talked about it last week is I think is to be celebrated is the use of technology to make worship accessible for more people. That we pivoted, we turned on a dime during the pandemic, and we made it possible for people to participate in worship, despite the fact that a lot of churches had closed their doors. I told this story on this webinar before about I was an interim pastor in Jacksonville, Florida, and there was a woman who was there on the very first service that the church had online. They were doing it on Facebook Live. She had been, because of physical limitations, she had not been physically able to come to church for 3 years. And for so many people, they saw it as less than because they weren't physically in the room. For her, she saw it as more than, because for 3 years, she had not been able to worship with her congregation. And she was literally typing into Facebook with tears in her eyes, saying how grateful she was to be a part of her congregation in that way. And I don't think that impulse is something to be feared. I think that's something to be embraced. Does it have limitations? Does it take the place of in-person gathering? No, that's not what I'm saying. But historically, when the church has figured out a way to unleash the experience of faith and get it into more people's hands, then thriving often takes place as a result of that.
Right.
So
I've often talked, Matt, in my tradition, in the Presbyterian Church, that it's in some ways these issues talk about the polarity between head and heart. A lot of Presbyterians over the last century have kind of worshipped and experienced religion from the head up, from the neck up.
Yep.
And so how do you connect the head with the heart, the experiential with the rational and the ordering? And I think you've lifted up some helpful ways for us to think about that. Realizing the time, I'm going to get in a question for Deborah Wright, who was finally able to join us today. Deborah, we're glad you're here. And she asked the question, she said, as we revert back toward kind of that percentage of population being involved in church, back toward something that more looks like the 1790s than it does 1956, could we see this as a trend of reversing the direction of how American church life has gone, and that now we're going to be moving back as secularism begins to take a more prominent role in the life of American culture? Are we going to have to move back to some of those early insights about how to spread religion?
So my argument today is yes. That these three impulses, the experiential, the egalitarian, and the accessible impulse, are actually tools that we can use in this moment, even in the midst of secularism. So, and I was referring to that somewhat with my tongue in cheek with that kind of early hook that I threw in about the 1790s versus the 1990s. In some ways, the 1790s are actually a pretty good parallel, because there are two things alongside one another. Ryan Burge says American culture is simultaneously becoming more religious and less religious at the same time. It's just happening in pockets of the culture. The same thing was true in the 1790s in a lot of ways. For those of us who are not threatened by secularism, and I would consider myself among that, and I'm assuming probably everybody on here, what I would say, though, is part of what those of us who adhere to the life of faith, I think, have to maintain is the extent to which why faith in God, faith in Jesus Christ matters. Why does it matter for the average person? But how do we do that in ways that's different than the command and control structure that tends to be the predominant way that's being offered in this day and time? We can do these things. We can make faith experiential, egalitarian, and accessible without having to utilize all of the ways of thinking that are more conservative. I was about to say brothers and sisters, but I probably should just say brothers utilize in a lot of ways. So,
Well, I would love for us, and I know you probably haven't got this planned for the third thing of this series, but I would love for us to have a conversation with seminary presidents about what this means about how we educate people for pastoral leadership, because I think that's one of the things that is exploding in terms of the variety of ways that's being done now, and with formal or informal imprimatur on the folks who go out to lead Christian communities.
Yeah, here's something that ended up on the cutting room floor that I'll just dangle and let y'all think about with me. So most of us are aware that there are not as many people going into congregational ministry as there used to be. So in that way, we don't have an immediate parallel for what I talked about in terms of, that happened in the early portions of the 19th century. But I looked at the ATS numbers about 3 or 4 years ago. So there was a decline in the ATS numbers during the Great Recession, but there's been a recovery since. The numbers have gone back up. There has not been a corresponding increase in the number of people going into congregational ministry. In other words, we're not at a high water mark, but neither are we at a low water mark. There's still a lot of people going to seminary. What's happened that's different is there's a lot of people going to seminary that are not going into congregational ministry. I think that's telling us something that we ought to pay attention to. There is still, I think, a sense in which the life of faith is a crucial element in culture, in experience, and life. There are a lot of people that are looking to ask and answer deep questions that are thinking about transcendence. They don't seem to be thinking that the ways to carry that out in practical terms is in the local church. And I think we got to pay attention to that, to the fact that we still have people who are focused on it, but don't see the expression of it in congregational life. And I think it's a little bit less, the sky is falling, the pipeline is broken, than, all right, what does that disconnect tell us?
All right, I'm going to bring us to a close just by noting 2 comments, one by Jay Wilkins and one by Mike Queen. Jay's just sort of pointing out, we're telling a Protestant story, wonder what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church and how that's affecting the church in America. And Mike Queen saying he's talked to 5 seminary div school deans and not a single one of them wants to change anything about their classical approach to training ministers. So there we are. All right, thank you, Matt. Do you have a tease for us for next week?
More of this. It's not more of the same. We'll have a church historian other than Matt Cook that joins us next week to talk about another one of these chapters. So,
all right, thank you so much, Matt, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday at 11 Eastern, 8 Pacific.